So just a little bit about CFNE. I think most of you guys are familiar with us, but we are a nonprofit community loan fund. We started it in 1975 to finance food cooperatives. And as the co-op sector has developed and evolved, our lending has evolved now as well. So we finance not only food co-ops, but also housing, worker-owned co-ops, producer co-ops, land trusts. And we have a real priority for racial and economic justice, both in our lending and also in trying to provide good business education to cooperatives.
And for today's agenda, we'd like you guys, as we've introduced ourselves, to do the same. But since there's a bunch of us, we're going to ask you to drop it in the chat. Okay, we're going to ask you to put your name, the organization you're affiliated with, your contact information, if you're comfortable with that, so that we can have some sort of networking opportunity for those of us who are willing to be reached out to or who'd like to see who's in the room. Okay, so please do that. We're excited to have you here. I would love to hear your voices, but as I said, we've got a ton of content we want to dig into. Okay, so thank you for that. Drop it in the chat, please. Today, we're going to start with a few references and definitions on where we're getting some of this content from. Primarily, we'll hear about the International Cooperative Alliance, and you'll see ICA over and over again. So that's a big pull for us, but we're also using other sources too, and we're happy to talk about those. We'll also dive into an overview of the 7 principles and a framework I think could be helpful in helping you integrate the idea of principles or get a better understanding of how principles fit into a practice or are informed by values. We'll dig into principles 1 and 2 specifically today. That'll be our focus. Theories around this, tools to help you engage these principles. And we'll take a little question break after that before diving into a few scenarios where we get to put principles into practice. We'll have a consumer co-op scenario, a worker co-op scenario, and a housing co-op scenario. So consider which of these you'd like to join now, so that when it's time to do this, you can seamlessly choose the room you want to be in, and we'll have that conversation. Okay? So major learning objectives for today. We want to get a deeper understanding, of course, of cooperative principles 1 and 2. We want to understand how to put these principles into practice. And we ultimately want to be able to assess how groups are practicing the principles and how do we make adjustments if desired.
Johan, can I ask you to just kind of like blow out the entire slide? Thanks, because I'm going to go kind of fast. Just a little background. So this series, we're focusing on the cooperative principles as though that is a monolith, and obviously it's not. People have been cooperating economically and socially, throughout human history in a lot of different ways. So the principles that sort of everybody in the modern co-op movement refers to are the principles developed by the International Cooperative Alliance, or the ICA. This is a group that was founded in England in the late 1800s and originally was pretty Eurocentric in scope. So I just want to acknowledge the limitations of that framing and the extent to which it's been, somewhat potentially exclusionary, whether, on purpose or not. In recent years, it has become much more international, as the name implies. So there really are people participating from all over the world in all different forms of cooperatives, from, small worker cooperatives to huge, producer co-ops. And as sort of a reflection of the growing awareness of who all participates in co-ops and the long history of cooperation, the principles have actually been revised several times, most recently in 1995. So when we talk about the principles, that's sort of the most current iteration, but just realize that it's not static and it really is very participatory in how they're developed.
So let's start with the basics. What is a cooperative, right? And we're thinking of a cooperative as defined in the ICA document as an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned, democratically controlled enterprise. So lots of words, but we have a few indications on where our eyes can help us see, what's the common thread here. We're thinking about self-law, choice, self-responsibility, and help and shared ownership with others to solve problems that we also share with them. So we just want to get to the bottom of this and start from there.
And we want to contextualize this within, today we're going to be talking about the first two principles, voluntary and open membership and democratic member control, but they really fit within this interlocking framework of all of the different principles. So there's also member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for community. And there's a real sense, I think you'll see throughout today, of how these are interlocking and sort of self-reinforcing. So just sort of remember that when we're talking about principles, it's not just the ones that we're talking about today, but really within this whole framework.
And one thing I really wanted to communicate was how principles fit in to a larger framework of values and practices. And I wanted to illustrate by using my own personal values, principles, and practices. So what are values? Values are those ideals that drive your behavior. They're what's in the treasure chest of your soul, right? That's what you really care about as an end in and of itself, right? For me, it's love, peace, and joy, right? That's the bottom line for me. The more I have that in my life, the more I feel rich. Principles. These are really lessons learned, informed by our values. What do we need to know as a heuristic or just something that helps us see and make decisions based on our values? And then practices. These are the things we see in other people and what other people see in us. And if this was a book, which this graphic is shaped like, the values and the principles are inside the book, right? They're kind of the content, and we see the cover, which is the practices. That's what shows up every day in your behavior, right? And for me, for example, if I'm thinking of love, a greater notion of love, not romantic love, a principle that helps me come into contact with that is what I call one with, right? And these are branded by me. It's just quick for me to remember. And the way I express that one withness is about giving and giving thanks. So generosity and gratitude. So if I understand love as connection, and I can realize that that means I'm one with you if I love you, when I give to you, I feel grateful because I've received, if we're really one. So these are how your values track into your principles and connect to your practices. So I just wanted to give a personal example of how these things really connect, because they build on each other and principles don't stand by themselves. So cooperative principles. Number one, voluntary and open membership. Now, before we begin, I'd like to ask you to consider a time when you've engaged with an institution, organization, or team and felt alienated, excluded, paternalized, or disempowered in some way. Consider that. I'll give you guys 5 to 10 seconds. Think about the response inside of you or your behavior in that environment. And next, I want you to consider what was missing. What would have made this experience live up to the principles that you might consider inherent to voluntary and open membership? And after you finish doing that, thinking of that piece that's missing, I want you to embody that. Maybe rename yourself that missing piece that you thought was there, and show up throughout this presentation as that missing piece, okay? So that's my challenge to you guys today. I wonder if anyone's gonna take it up. But either way, let's begin. So voluntary and open membership. It states cooperatives are voluntary organizations open to all persons able to use their services and willing to accept the responsibilities of membership without gender, social, racial, or political, religious discrimination, right? So again, a mouthful, but what stands out to you folks? Drop it in the chat, right? I want to see what is the focus that you have when you hear this, right? This voluntary organizations open to all who are willing to accept responsibilities, right? Because what stands out to me are naturally the keywords in this principle, the voluntary aspect, right? The personal choice to engage, the open to all without discrimination aspect, right? Kind of an open boxed scenario, and accepting the responsibilities, which is membership, right? You want to be a part of something, you've got to be willing to accept the responsibilities, right? So these are things that stick out to me. Keep dropping those ideas in the chat. And when it comes to the voluntary aspect, the question is, why should I join, right? Why should I make the choice to be a part of something, right? And so that's a personal decision. And to engage that decision, I feel people need to engage their identities. In other words, who am I, right? Who am I as an individual, as Johan Matthews, as a creative leader, community engaged individual, storyteller, sense maker? Who am I, right? Who am I from a social perspective, right? A father, a son, an immigrant, a Caribbean, a person of Caribbean heritage, Black, right? Social identity. You want to think about, how do I behave, right? What are my values, right? Values can be aspirational, right? It's what we want to be. There's a lot of what we think values are, but that's just one leg of it. The other leg could be core values, the things you really care about, the things that you're willing, again, to be, to lose money, time, attention over, right? Or accidental, the things that just stick to you because of your life experience. What are my values? How do I behave? What am I bringing to the table? To use the, topic of this workshop, the title of this workshop, sorry, and bring that into context. What am I bringing to the table? What skills, strengths do I have? You're gonna have a hard time engaging other people if you don't know what you're bringing to that group, right? In order to be interdependent, you must have a sense of independence. In order to share, you must have. What problems am I hungry to solve, right? What are the burning problems in the world that I'm looking to engage, right? And then from an interpersonal perspective, you're thinking about them. Who are they, right? If you're thinking of joining an existing co-op or creating an existing co-op with other people, who are these other people, right? What are their identities, individually and socially? How do they behave? What are their values? Who are they serving? And how are they serving them, right? Is it the way that you believe these people need to be served? And what problems are they hungry to solve? Again, keeping it with our metaphor, right? And so before I'm initiated into this group, I want to understand, are our identity, our interests, our values aligned, right? Do we connect across these two points, right? Me and them. And then am I going to feel fulfilled in partnership with these people, right? Do we share a vision for success, in other words, right? And so that's me engaging in this voluntary piece. Why should I join? I feel like we have to answer these questions before we step into a role where we're sharing a future with a group of people or another person. The second piece, open to all without discrimination. To me, the question is, who's allowed to join, right? And so the idea here is without discrimination, right? And what is discrimination? The unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, right? But if we had some nuance to this, we can take this further back. Our ancestors had to discriminate between certain fruits and herbs, and they had to criminalize certain choices over other choices, right? Because they felt it was bad for them. And so we have to think about what that means today when we engage the idea of discrimination. How are people making choices about other people to stay away from them or to not engage with them because they feel it's bad for them, right? And so that's a big piece. But it also stems from a particular perspective, right? Who's the one doing the discrimination? And so, we try to answer this with inclusion, right? And we think about this quote that I found in the ICA journal. It says, there should be no arbitrary restrictions placed on persons wishing to become members, right? The only limit on membership being imposed by the purpose of the cooperative. So how are we engaging members based on our purpose, right? Is there room to make choices about who should join based on our purpose? And, on the flip side of that discrimination idea, where we see some people discriminating against others, we're thinking of the need for solidarity in certain groups, right? And I'm thinking about Black people, women, immigrants, people who are historically excluded. How do they practice open to all today amidst the ongoing impacts of white supremacy, patriarchal, capitalist-based exclusion? How do they do that, right? When we have this idea of open to all. And so before we, engage that question, I'd like to contrast principle 1, voluntary and open membership, with Kawaida principle, which is the basis for Kwanzaa, the holiday, Umoja, or unity, right? And so they created that principle for a reason, in contrast to this principle, which is pretty interesting. And it's to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, and race. So there's a need for this principle, there's a need for that principle. And so my question is, how does open to all reconcile with the need for unity, right? And so that's not something we're going to solve today, but I think it's a really important question. So once you drop your thoughts in the chat, okay? And so one thing that I think is definitely not an answer to this is tokenism, right? And this is referenced in the text. There's a quote: if membership is compulsory, membership becomes tokenistic rather than an exercise of the fundamental right to human freedom of association. People want a need to choose who they're around. This is the reason why we're creating a cooperative, right? We're trying to create either an alternative to the existing enterprise structure, or we're trying to create a shared future with people who believe the things that we believe in, right? So we need to be free to associate with folks, or to, be in a better position in life. And inviting one person from these groups that have been historically or previously discriminated, it's not enough. I always say you gotta have more than one, more than 1%, more than one, because otherwise that person is counted among your members, but they're not cared for, right? And so we want to engage that thoughtfully, whether you're part of a majority group or a minority group. You want to practice that thoughtfully, no matter, again, what side of the color equation you're on, or the gender equation. You want to think about what that means to have a token member, right? And so the last piece of this is, how do I leave, right? And this should lighten things up. If people can't leave, it's a cult, Otherwise, it's cool. If they can't leave, it's a cult, right? So you need to think about that. And to engage that, we're thinking about exit agreements upon entry. I can invoke Stephen Covey's principle, begin with the end in mind in this case, right? And so let's think about the end. What is the member's journey? Retirement might be the last thing we expect this person to do, right? Retire, get their investment back, that type of vibe. Before that, various levels of membership, from a mature member all the way down to a novice or immature or newbie member, right? And before that, we had to orient them, right? They were oriented into the group. And before that, there was interest. So how are we engaging the potential member or member at each point? How are they transitioning? How do we address the needs inherent in each stage of this, right? And how do we create agreements that make it very clear what this process is supposed to be like? How do we create the ideal journey? So this is where your tools, practices, structures come in this principle. And so as the individual matures throughout their tenure as a member, the organization will also mature, engaging with its environment. And so how do larger, more complex groups maintain the principle of open and voluntary membership? As the organization grows in members and customers and its footprint, it's going to become more and more complex. And so we want to think about that process. And this is a graph that I saw in a different talk about complexity that I wanted to invoke, right? On the vertical column, it goes from easy to difficult, and it's in reference to tools, right? Tools like a toothbrush, or a tool as high as an organization, a cooperative, right? From a prosthetic to an instrument, right? That are easy to use to difficult to use. On the horizontal line, we're talking about human skill level. And from the left, we're talking about compromised abilities or a disability, all the way to the right, where we're talking about a superior ability or a talent, right? And so I wanted to discuss two important elements that could be understood in this graph. The first is education. When you have a member who's used to being an employee and has to make the shift to being an owner, that's a difficult ask for that person to embody that shift very quickly. So there needs to be education. And so you might find it difficult if you're a member coming on board to create financial statements, to understand financial statements, to understand why the organization is making decisions based on those financial statements. And so you need to be educated, right? And so at first it's difficult, right, for the average person, right, in the middle line. They need to be educated, and that content might be difficult for them. And over time, we see that education increases the ability, right? So it becomes easier over time. And on the left side of that, we can see the opposite effect coming from something like outsourcing, because as your membership grows, you're not going to spend time necessarily one-on-one introducing a member to all of the elements of your organization. Rather, you're going to probably have a handbook or a video or something like that. And so you're kind of outsourcing that. And over time, we see the skills decreasing based on outsourcing. So outsourcing can be very useful, it's necessary, but your skills decrease over time. So the question here is, how do we create the conditions for ongoing skill building, right? While recognizing what needs to be outsourced, okay? And so I'll go quickly here as I'm out of time. The final piece is is a tool to help you as a member decide how to accept responsibilities, and it's called the 12 culture keys. And so the first you want to think about is power and influence. You show up to this organization, how is power and influence exhibiting itself? Is it one person talking a lot? Is it more democratic? How are roles defined? Are they clear? Are they constantly shifting? Planning and goal setting, how is that process done? Is it behind the doors? Is it engagement or participatory or driven? How are they solving problems together, right? When they decide what's a problem, how is that happening? When they decide what's a solution, how is that happening? How are they making decisions? Is it democratically? Is it unanimously? Is it by shouting the other person down? What is happening there? Are they value centered, or are they driven by the market? How do they handle conflict, right? How do they manage conflict when people disagree with each other? What do they reward? Do they have a training budget, for example, that's $100 for everybody? Or do they encourage people to take things that are interesting to them and try to find the money after? How do they engage customers? How do they hire? What's their teamwork like? What's the structure, right? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit? Is it cooperative? You want to be able to engage these ideas to some extent to be able to assess what responsibilities you can take on here. And lastly, I'll say this, people engage organizations from different levels, and this is called fire theory. This is an expression of the different ways that people relate to an organization. The first is authentic. It's the desire to feel significant in one's life, one's activities. It's driven by connectedness, and it leads to self-actualization. And an example would be power coming from a commitment to higher ideals. Next, we're thinking of participation, a need to feel accepted, where interpersonal fit leads to collaboration and teamwork. And power comes from being a part of the family. And we have expertise, the power comes from being competent, and functionality leads eventually to your rise in the hierarchy. And power comes from being best in class. So where do you fit into this? Where do you prefer to be? Who do you want to be with? Think about that. And I'll end there. Okay.
All right, shifting gears. Okay, so second principle is democratic member control. take this in chunks because it's super dense. Cooperatives are democratic organizations controlled by their members. So they're not controlled by the CEO, they're not controlled by the general manager. And it's important to sort of like make a distinction between what's governance, what's like the big picture, who are we, where are we going, what are we about, and day-to-day management. Ultimately, the accountability is to the members. Who actively participate in setting policies and making decisions. So not just making decisions, not everybody makes every decision, but broad policies that can guide how the organization behaves and how people in it behave. People serving as elected representatives are accountable to the membership, okay? And in primary cooperatives, members have equal voting rights, one member, one vote. And cooperatives at other levels are also organized in a democratic manner. So primary cooperative means like, say, a worker co-op where literally every member has a vote on whatever member decisions. And like a secondary cooperative would be, say, a producer co-op where there are like several farms, and each of those farms has, it counts as one member and has one vote toward the larger co-op. But in either case, the co-op ultimately is accountable to its members to make sure it's meeting their needs. And how member control happens, there's sort of a spectrum of models depending on, how big the co-op is, how complex, what sector, what its values are. Everything from, direct collective governance and management where everybody kind of does everything and has the same jobs and makes every decision together, which might work in a small and very transparent and very agile organization, through to kind of a direct democracy where maybe all the members sit on the board, but they're really clear about, we have our board hat on now, and then we have a job that we do that's separate, to more representative democracy where all the members, maybe the one member, one vote, the vote that they have is mostly for electing board representatives. And then they sort of delegate a certain amount of authority to those board representatives to make certain decisions. And just, a couple of cautions about this model, because people can kind of get hung up on this and be like, wait a minute, we get to make all the decisions. We're the members. This is our thing. You can have democratic governance and you can still have some sort of a hierarchy or different operational responsibilities. So those two can coexist, and it's really just about making sure that there's a clear mechanism for who makes what decisions and how is that management ultimately responsible to the members. And also on the other end of the spectrum, even if you have a fully collective governance and management where everybody's involved in every decision, it's still important to know what decision you're making and sort of which hat you have on. So am I wearing my worker hat or my owner hat, for instance, because your personal interest as a worker in terms of like, how much do you get paid or what shifts do you get might be really different than your interest as an owner of how do I make sure that this business asset that we have, that we share, that ensures all of our jobs is sustainable. So how do you decide who does what? This was a question that came up in a bunch of y'all's registrations. Generally, there's sort of two tests that you can have. One is the significance test. So what decisions do all members make? And this is really about, does it affect the survival of the co-op? Does it affect everybody and for a long term? And then the other is the extensiveness test, which, oh, sorry, I'm going through these fast. So significant test, yeah, extensive test, thank you. So decisions that maybe might not be for all of the members to make, because maybe there are, decisions that impact the co-op for a shorter time period, or don't really impact its survival, but still impact a large number of the co-op members, or commit a significant amount of the co-op's financial resources or are going to affect sort of the fundamental operations of the co-op over a long period of time. So those might be decisions that you want for your board to take up and not just leave to your management. And then the nitty gritty day to day, you know, which toner are we ordering for the copier? Those types of decisions are going to be left to management in a scenario where you're delegating certain responsibilities to managers. One tool that a lot of co-ops use to just get clear about this stuff is a decision matrix. So basically, you know, you sort of grid out who are the decision makers. Do your members make certain decisions? Your board, your management team? Maybe maybe you want to take it even a level down from that and say like departmental teams or functional teams. But then think about what are the decisions that have to be made periodically in the co-op, and get clear amongst yourselves who makes which decisions. And you can use that extensiveness and significance test to sort of see who does this impact, how important is it, how long-term is it, does it impact our survival? But this can be a really good tool for kind of having a conversation about that stuff. So, you know, to take one example from here, who do you think would need to have input on changing the bylaws? Is that a member decision? That's something that's going to impact the long-term nature of identity of the co-op? Is it something that the board can decide because it's going to sort of commit the co-op for a certain period of time, but not long-term? Or is it something that the management team can decide that's sort of a day-to-day decision? And people can either just shout out or like throw it in the chat. Changing bylaws, who should take that decision? Members. Anybody disagree? Members, yeah. Yeah, because it's something that really has to do with the fundamental nature of the co-op. It's who's a member, how do you decide who becomes a member, what are the benefits of membership, et cetera. Yeah. So we'll send out the slides and y'all can dig into that more deeply, but let's keep rolling. So how do you encourage people to really participate as members? Obviously, knowing what role they play in governance is really important, and seeing themselves reflected, so not just at a token level, but seeing people who are like them in certain ways participating as leaders is really critical. Also, having meetings and communication that are accessible. So that might mean, you know, what time are your meetings? Are they after work? Are they on weekends? Is there babysitting? Can you get communications from the co-op in different formats? Ongoing education, which is its own co-op principle, but that's, you know, probably the single best way to encourage participation, because if people don't feel kind of competent, they're not going to feel confident and they're not going to participate. Depending on the co-op model, you may need incentives, whether it's, you know, paying for people to come to meetings or providing pizza or having a door prize for, you know, your annual meeting or whatever. And then the nature of your facilitation in terms of really making it a space where everybody's voices can be heard. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I love this line for us. So this is from the ICA guidance on these principles. It says, democratic process by itself does not guarantee competence. So, okay, great. We have open voluntary membership. Everybody can join, but for people to really participate democratically in a way that's going to be in their own interest and in the long-term interest of the co-op and its membership, there needs to be, you know, knowledge and good processes and good structures to make that actually work out the best for everybody. So just real quickly, some key tools for democratic governance. Your structure, your processes, your procedures, your bylaws really spell a lot of this out. And a lot of the times when we're asked to sort of help a co-op that's on the skids, it's, well, y'all haven't had an election in a really long time. You've got the same people making decisions that always have, or you don't have term limits, or there's one class, you know, the only people on your board are management, and that doesn't represent all of your membership. Information sharing, so having a predictable schedule about, you know, when are meetings, the agenda's announced ahead of time, notes come out at a certain time afterwards. And then also sharing information in a way that's not only available, but really accessible and understandable. So, you know, for instance, don't get, you know, open book management is not giving people a 7-page printout of all of your financials. That's super overwhelming. But what's a dashboard that everybody can look at and see, and, you know, 3 or 4 images, how's the co-op doing financially? Are we making money or not? Are we up or down compared to last year? So really thinking about who you're sharing information with and making sure that that information is accessible in a meaningful way. And then this commitment to ongoing member education and development with an equity and justice lens. So making sure that people have the information that they need and the skills to really be able to fully participate, and periodically assessing, how are we doing? You know, what areas do we need to skill up in? Somebody made a comment in the chat earlier about sort of rights and responsibilities changing over time. And you definitely see co-ops maturing out of functionality where they forget that they have to continually refresh people's ability to participate as members. And then last is systems for regular recruiting, training, and onboarding, both of your membership and of your officers. So I think we're going to pause there and take a breath and invite you guys to ask some questions, and then maybe take a little break and go into some breakout groups.
Yep. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have it. Otherwise, we're going to dive into some breakout groups.
This is a general question that maybe should wait for the breakout group, but I'm curious to know what kind of questions, and I'm a food co-op, so it's more focused on the food people. What kind of questions are you asking your members to make decisions on? I would love some examples.
I mean, some of it does depend on the size of the co-op and the industry, but certainly board elections, bylaws changes, things that could impact the fundamental identity of the co-op. So for a food co-op, moving location might be a member decision, or Joe and Maggie, if you guys want to jump in here from the food co-op angle, do so.
I can speak from the experience of Harvest Co-op in Boston, which I think did not do a good job of membership engagement and sort of deciding who decides what. But for example, the question of whether or not to expand and to where, I think would be a member discussion and a member decision. Obviously board elections, things like hiring a general manager, general inventory questions generally, I think would just devolve to management, maybe to the board. There have been questions at food co-ops about boycotting certain products or certain manufacturers. That might start as a board discussion, and if there's no agreement, then expand to a membership discussion, I think. Because those are things that really, I think, connect to people's values that people would really care about.
Thanks.
One of the questions when I was finance manager at Green Star that went to members was about removing this 2% member discount at the register, which inside the cooperative and from manager's perspective, this was a financial decision. This was not a membership decision, but it turned out felt that it was part of the identity. It was part of the experience that they had was to get this discount. That it wasn't a financial question. It was a token of respect. It had all these other social implications that were not non-financial, and so they the board requested that it be sent out to everyone to decide on.
All right, well, unless there are any burning questions, I'm going to drop the link to the deck that we're going to use for the breakout. So it should be in your chat. Everyone click on it, and then I'm going to open up a few rooms food, worker, and housing co-op that you can self-select to be a part of. Okay.
And if you don't get a little breakout prompt, and then you can also just rename yourself for the group that you want to go in, and Johan can put you in manually, because depending on which version of Zoom you have, that you should be able to opt in down in your menu bar below.
Thank you for inviting me, Johan, to join a group. I'll see you later.
Seems like everyone's back now. I hope that was edifying. I'm going to share my screen and we'll just go group by group with a little bit of a share out. Okay. So everyone can see my screen. So housing co-op. You guys down to share out first? Just give us a little summary and, you know, a little bit of what you discussed.
I think Swain is going to do our report back.
Oh.
Thanks.
Oh, it's like camera right now. Hello, everybody. So, are we doing dramatic reading beforehand, or are we just jumping into the?
We can summarize. If you'd like to reference any point, that's no problem. Like if you want to read
Okay.
it.
So, in short, pretty much there's a longtime treasurer or a longtime member who's been living at the house for a while, who believes that the Victorian home shouldn't take out any loans because the co-op shouldn't have any debt, or the house shouldn't have any debt. I didn't even notice the difference between how he phrased it to before. But they've reached a point where they're running out of reserves. If they don't get it fully occupied, they've got 5 members and 5 vacancies. All the members sit on the board, and it's been around since 1990. So the stakeholders, I don't even think I really addressed the, hold up. Oh, basically, yeah, the co-op is in a gentrifying neighborhood. The co-op owns the house. They want to keep the member rents affordable. It's a community anchor, and the property has increased in value. They need some maintenance. So they got to they want to talk about taking out a loan. The treasurer is against it. So they can do repairs on the house and a sagging porch, which is a safety concern. So in the situation, the stakeholders are the residents, the neighbors, and the community members. They seem to value low rent. There didn't seem to be much community engagement in the decision making. And it's not clear how is the treasurer elected or selected. It seems to be that he has a lot of control and that people leave rather than coming up with solutions. And some of the practices that we thought are, can members be invited to invest financially in a co-op? What are the ways that they can vote for a new treasurer? People, I think that the co-op or the board can identify what people want and need, and figure out some transparency of people's agendas to join the co-op or participate in the co-op, and also bring on new members that bring more than necessarily paying a rent. How can they contribute to the co-op? Can they do construction? Can they contribute to programming or like, you know, the lifestyle of the people that are in the co-op or the whole housing co-op?
Excellent. I hope that was communicated clearly. I don't know if we have any thoughts or immediate responses before we move on to the next one. Okay, let's go down to the consumer co-op. This is a food-based co-op, medium urban-sized food co-op established 1980. Could the person who's reporting out give us a brief summary, and then we'll cover some of the report outs.
Oh, okay. So this is Corin from the Wolfboro Food Co-op. And please, my two, Joe was leading this, but my two collaborators, please shout in when I miss something. So we're talking here about a co-op that was formed over 10 years ago in a community that at that time was predominantly white. And the same board members have been there since for all these years, and they are very much tied to their original idea of selling organic food, probably for the kind of food that they're used to eating. I'm assuming that they have a general manager now who sees the community surrounding the co-op, notices that a lot of people are going to other stores which are actually providing food for the people who have moved into the community, and these are people from different parts of the world, different ethnic groups, and this co-op is not supplying that kind of food. So the general manager would like very much to embrace those new members of the community by offering different kinds of foods, but her vision for the store and, of course, the board's vision for the store are not in alignment. And so she's wondering about what could be done to change, to actually broaden what she serves to her community. We looked at the question was about the different stakeholders. And of course, it was pointed out by one of our group that, the staff has a powerful link with members and non-members. And that's a group that the general manager could definitely leverage. The board members, of course, have a stake, but they are a very elite, seems that they're a very elitist group. So how would we diversify that? We have to think of our non-members as customers as well. I mean, they're stakeholders in that's where they go to get their food. They may not be paid up members, but they are stakeholders. And then we also talked about the fact that, suppliers are stakeholders because the co-op, it's like any organization. If you're a supplier, you're reliant upon who you're supplying to. And if the co-op isn't buying their food, maybe some of the local companies, perhaps often new companies that have moved to the community, as the community is diversified, they're being shut out, and they should be stakeholders. So in terms of value, who values what? Some of the staff may have been there for a long time and they would value the original organic food. The store manager clearly has different values to the board. The store manager wants to be inclusive and to align the foods, the product line more with what is being her community would enjoy. But the board is very much status quo. They have a limited circle. They're much more about, somebody said, much more about we. And of course, there are other suppliers, although we want to embrace new suppliers, there are the traditional suppliers that might be losing out as they change the product mix. That's as far as we got on our sort of 4 or 5 pillars of conversation. We thought of some ways, maybe to try to include the broader community. One was to reach out to the different groups that inevitably form as diverse groups move into any community, and seek out the leaders and get some voices from them about what would change. We also thought there's a financial reason why that the general manager could make for changing the product line. And also, there's bound to be some members who are in alignment with the general manager, and the general manager should seek them out, because actually at the general meeting or prior to the general meeting, they could send out some resolutions, because it's time that board turned a little. Maybe term limits would be a good idea, because if they've been around for a long time, they probably got set in their ideas, which is pretty normal for all of us, and fresh blood is often a good idea, but not the absolute end all. So anything else, anybody? I'd be quiet now.
Any thoughts or questions on this? It's interesting to see how different the food and the housing co-op is. When you live amongst people, that creates different tensions, versus, when you show up to a consumer co-op or a food co-op, and you kind of have greater division. That's maybe easier to talk about, but harder in some sense if you're an employee. But anyway, if there aren't any more questions, we can move on to the other one.
I just want to say, Johan, it really goes back to what you said at the very beginning about a time when you felt shut out of something, and that's how you feel. You know, that store's not for me. People like me don't shop there. People like me aren't welcome there, and that's a terrible, terrible situation for any kind of organization to get themselves into.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Just
Okay.
as an aside on food co-ops, it's really interesting working with people across different co-op sectors, because often the local food co-op is the face of cooperativism for them in their community. It may be the first or the only place that they encounter co-ops. So as go the food co-ops, so go we all.
Yeah, this was a rich example, and I completely agree with that. That's my interpretation of a co-op here in the capital region, you know, the food co-ops in the different towns. So very cool. All right, let's go to the first example here. So I'm gonna have to go back quite a bit. Okay. This is a worker co-op, and I'll let you guys take it from here.
I can do it, unless does someone else from our group want to do it? We started discussing who would do this before we came back to the big group. Well, just chime in if anyone wants to add anything. But in this example, there's a restaurant that was founded by three management staff, and the head chef were the founders of this co-op, which is a restaurant. The kitchen staff, and those folks identify primarily as white, they're mostly college educated, they're US born. And then the kitchen staff are primarily Central American immigrants who have limited English and education ranging from elementary to some high school. And there's this gap because people in the kitchen staff are not tending to want to join as members, which it seems like from the description didn't really start to get brought up or addressed as an issue, except when there was a corporate tax rate increase. And as a result, the co-op would have to start paying a higher tax bill on the profit that's earned by the non-members. So then the non-members in the kitchen begin to get approached to say, hey, would you want to join? You know, like, because obviously this would increase the profitability of the co-op and benefit all people as members. But it sounds like folks have been saying, actually, no, like, I'm not interested in joining. So we discussed, and then there were lots of other details in there, but we did. So I guess the stakeholders are all within this co-op, and it's the folks who are members who tend to be the management and the higher kind of staff in the hierarchy, and then the non-member workers. In terms of the values, it didn't come through very clearly, I don't think, from the description, aside from like a real commitment to making it a profitable business. And I think that the major dissonance that we identified was this gap between, you know, like, why are people not wanting to become members who are working there? Like, what would be the barriers, or even just the cultural perceptions or things like that that would prevent them? And so we identified, you know, among the first couple like highlights of that, we said definitely it seems like there's a big barrier to people wanting to join, in that the buy-in to be a member is at $6,000 and 18 months. And so that, you know, right from the get-go, it might put folks in a position where that feels like a very high buy-in. It might not be possible for all people. It wasn't clear if there's ways being created to say, okay, it's a high buy-in, but you can pay over months, or, you know, it didn't seem like there was really like a very accessible way to like overcome that high buy-in for people to whom it might not be as possible. And then another thing we noticed was the fact that there is this dichotomy between language groups. And so if the meetings are all held in English, and a lot of the materials that are produced from those meetings are really long, like it says there's, you know, typically like a 7-page financial report, et cetera, then it's not really being done in a way that would make, for example, their Spanish-speaking colleagues feel comfortable to join, especially folks that are not necessarily college educated or who have gone through like extensive financial training, to be able to, you know, participate like meaningfully. So I think those were the two main practices and tools that we identified, was like to try to start making your meetings more accessible linguistically so that folks from different language groups could participate, make them more accessible in terms of the materials and how they're presented, and then start getting some ongoing education so that folks, you know, just like what I think should happen probably at all co-ops all the time, theoretically, is, you know, education so that folks understand the role of members and are encouraged to play that role and encouraged to like support the cooperative movement as a movement. Oh, and then also finding ways and mechanisms so that maybe there could be a balance between that high buy-in expected of the members and balancing that with the patronage, because further in the description it mentioned that folks were feeling like the patronage wasn't really high enough to like justify that high cost of buy-in. So that needs to be like somehow adjusted. Yeah, did anyone else have other points that I missed?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting example. See, so we have some stuff in the chat. Apologize for the screenplay, but it's all here now. But yeah, definitely a really rich example. Why would someone choose to not be an owner, right? If you had the opportunity to own the place where you went to work every day, even if it's a small portion, what reason would you say, you know, have to say no to? You know, that's kind of a crazy scenario. You know, most people show up to work every day and they're not getting anything other than their paycheck. If you get to have something more, why not? You know, that cost may seem too high for them. And that's really interesting to me. All right.
Yeah, and what Les says, lack of education, as mentioned before, and I think that that's, you know, this sort of gets into, you know, co-op principle 5 and sort of member education, that the co-op has a responsibility to continually be putting out information about what's in it for the members, and revising things like the membership buy-in and how patronage is determined, all those things, so that it's really clear what the benefits are, because your members are not dumb. They're doing an intricate sort of like return on investment thought about how much time do I spend in meetings, how much arguing do I have to do with people, how much is my buy-in compared to what I get out both financially and socially.
Yeah, and to connect this to one of the tenets of FIRO theory, you know, participation, you're not going to get people engaged in a process if you've ignored them for the last couple of years. You know, I do a lot of work with local governments and trying to help them facilitate community engagement, and they can't get people to show up to stuff because they've been ignoring them for a decade, and like, they must not care about their kids' school. Of course they do. About their sidewalks, of course they do, but they're not going to show up after they've been ignored. So, you know, it's a really important point here. You have to build the capacity to be heard between, you know, groups. You know, it's an interesting dynamic. So that's all I'll say. If there aren't any final questions, thoughts, concerns, we can kind of, you know, do the wrap up and see how things go. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and I'm gonna share a different screen, which is just our original presentation. Okay. All right, so the call to action here is to consider how joining a co-op might enable you to better relate to yourself. You know, what are your values? What are your principles? How are you going to get into the world using those values and principles? How are you going to better relate to others, you know, to the people that you work with, to the customers, right? How it relates to the power structure in that, the membership, which votes, the board, which governs, the management, which oversees operations. how is joining a co-op or becoming a co-op going to help you better relate to those people and stakeholders? And how is it going to help you better relate to the whole system, right? In terms of money in a capitalist system, profit or patronage or information, right? Engaging in the process of planning from strategic to marketing to whatever else, and reports that are generated by that, right? We have to increase our ability or our ability with the team to understand these things. And that's definitely a great value add, I think, from the cooperative structure, just the enhanced education that comes with being being an owner, that you don't have to go through it yourself, but can learn with other people. I think co-ops help us to do a lot of things in this regard. And so as we wrap up, we want to create some space for final questions. We want to highlight what's coming up next in terms of the workshop. We have a Ready for Capital workshop in May, and we have another cooperative principles workshop in June. But let's just open this up for any final thoughts and reflections before we close out.
Yeah, and then one other thing I wanted to mention, if you'll bump to the next slide, is there are a few really good resources. I know that there are a number of folks here who are part of co-ops who are either in formation and you're just starting to think about these things, or you've hit some snags. These are some good, just sort of foundational documents, and also this practical guide for managers and others man, it's such a meaty document that really gets into the nuts and bolts of how to do a lot of this stuff, and has some good, workbooks and templates and stuff like that. So encourage people to dig into those, and also just reach out to, Johan, myself, your loan officer, because we're happy to be of service to think through some of this stuff.
Absolutely.
I think that sometimes there are some really simple things that we don't do that we should be doing, that actually make people feel connected, and membership connected. I don't know what they all are. I could probably, if we sat down for a while in another group, we could probably figure them out. But I was wondering if you have any kind of, like, if we could have at some point a brainstormer, and maybe you guys already have a list of that. It's such simple things. I mean, even like at the checkout, how do people at the checkout talk to the customers, talk to the members, show their appreciation? And I'm sure there are lots of other things apart from going through the whole laborious. I mean, obviously, there's all that technical stuff we have to do with regard to governance, et cetera, which is much heavier. But it's the light touch. What are some of the light touches we can do on an everyday basis to make sure that our members feel appreciated, but also engaged?
Yeah, before we jump in, and I see Carolyn's ready to jump in, any other members from the audience, have ideas around that?
That was what I was going to ask for too.
Boom. On the same page. Pack, Walla, Patty. Okay. Well, let's dive in. What are some thoughts from the staff then?
One thing I've been doing with our customers and members is actually asking them what their 2 or 3 favorite locally owned small businesses are, because I was thinking of putting a map up on the wall of those, first of all, to help new customers, also to build a sense of the other businesses feeling that we respect them and want to include them, and also just engage with the members or the shoppers to get their thoughts. I'm always trying to think of ways just to ask them questions about stuff that would be interesting to us as a small business ourselves. But I don't know, that's just one small thing that I do. And I work in the store frequently, so I can do that.
I would throw in something that both you and the general manager of Fiddleheads Food Co-op in New London have said to me, which is that especially during the pandemic, a degree of responsiveness to the concerns of the shoppers has made shoppers more comfortable shopping in the food co-ops than going into any of the grocery stores. So having someone ask, what, and make changes as people say, oh, could you do this? Could you do that? I think really makes a difference and makes somebody feel heard and makes the experience of being in the food co-op a better experience for people.
And also when you do that, giving credit where credit's due and also tooting your own horn. So saying, we heard from members that blah, blah, blah. And so here's what we did.
Right.
Because making the change, even though it's good that you made the change and you're being responsive, people don't know that that came from the membership unless you tell them. And so it is totally okay and important to be transparent about that this is a two-way flow of information.
I would add that I think there's a cooperative restaurant that I also work with in Somerville, and I think they sort of paying attention to suggestions that were coming from people who had patronized their restaurants before, did a fairly massive shift in their model. And instead of having people come into their restaurant, they have a shared meals concept. They have figured out a way to package meals, get them to people, or get people lists of ingredients, and then they do the shared meal on Zoom. So they've really sort of addressed people's interest in continuing to stay connected and figured out a way to do that works with their business model, or changes their business model. So I think responsiveness to people is really key.
And I just want to say thank you to everybody. I know we're at time. So if you have to hop, by all means, thank you for coming. And if folks want to stay and talk shop for a couple of minutes, that's fine too.
Patty, you had a thought, or it was just an accident there?
No, I have a thought. I just couldn't decide whether I was going to share it. And I have a mask on. It's hard for me to talk with the mask on, but I did want to just kind of tag on to what Maggie was saying about getting people's thoughts and being responsive. And with the pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, we did our first member survey, member-wide survey in probably forever, but we may have done one in the past. Last year, when we were preparing to reopen after having been closed for 12 weeks at the start of the pandemic. And we had the biggest response that we've ever had to any member outreach activity. We had just about 10% of our members respond to this survey. And we got all kinds, it was a very open-ended questions, but we got so many responses that it's taken us months to parse through them all. And it just felt like this is a great momentum to tack onto to keep this member engagement going, using this sort of context of the crisis of the pandemic and that engagement that people were really excited to be heard, really excited to be asked. And then we're also about to produce an annual report for the first time, really, for our co-op to ever produce an annual report. And in that report, we're going to publish the results of the survey with sort of a correlation, aggregation of the comments and the sort of topics of the comments that people spoke about, products, staff, cooperative principles, et cetera. And then around that, we're going to list some of the metrics that we've been measuring that relate to those items, so that there's that sort of correlation between what members are telling us they're interested in and how we're meeting those needs through some sort of metrics that we're looking at. So it's just yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Thanks for sharing. So much has been shared and a few of us have left, but I would just encourage folks to engage the core team, and that'll emanate outward naturally. Identify individuals, folks who are doing things that we like, and incentivize that and reward that and tell that story, so that you have the embodiment of your values present and in front of everyone, and that'll just continue to have ripples. And so, that's something that, non-cooperative groups do, who are trying to do that. And I think cooperatives can do that as well.
Can I ask a general question? When we signed up for this, there was a question about, about our demographics of our membership. we are in a very white community in rural New Hampshire. And it's quite conservative, or is getting less so, I'm happy to say. Just putting my true colors out there. But on our request, for information, it's really very, very limited. It's name and address and telephone number, and whether they want to get involved in volunteering. We are not including at the current time any information about sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and I guess even though and military, et cetera, I guess we should be including that. Is everybody including that on their applications?
No, those are demographics that we have to track more for worker co-ops than necessarily for groceries and stuff like that. So I've noticed that about most of the food co-ops say we don't track this and that, and that's fine. I don't know in terms of practice for their own purposes what co-ops may choose to track.
Well, I wonder if we shouldn't do it because it actually shows our values, because we recognize that those issues are important issues and part of our values. I mean, I don't know whether, it can't be Corin decides those are the important values. Again, is that a board decision? Is that a member decision that we include that stuff? Some of us are there's this long road, long pathway towards whatever you want to call it, being an anti-racist, or having some people say enlightened or whatever, and we're all at different stages along that pathway, and those that are farther ahead think the ones in the middle are backward, and those at the beginning think everybody else is crazy. So it's really hard to be you have to, I don't know how you navigate that in a perfect world. However, showing inclusivity by putting it out there might not be a bad thing, even though some people might think I'm crazy.
It's true, and also you never know. It's interesting the things that we assume when we don't ask. So, I mean, we had an interesting experience with my old co-op where we asked each of the managers to come up with sort of like the demographics and psychographics of our clients, and each of them sort of said, "Oh, we have a lot of clients who look like me." Whatever they're, oh, we've got a bunch of middle-aged men. Oh, we've got a bunch of Latinas. Oh, we've got a bunch of, yeah.
I suppose
It's
I just
easy
make
to-
it optional. I mean, you don't have to include it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But if you want to, you can. And
Yeah.
that's not offensive to anybody.
I think it's a shared values question. You count what you care about. If you guys think it's important, then you'll count it. And when it comes to your values, they're not values unless, you can say as evidenced by this, they're not really values. They're more aspirational values, which are okay. You have a plan to work towards it. But I think every member should understand their values, express those to understand what the shared values are. And then you can say, okay, if these really are values, what's the evidence? And so you can go from there. But, if you don't care about it, you're not going to pay attention to it. If you do care about it, you might want to measure it, right? Measuring obscures things. It does things to the mind, but at the same time, you can't see any change until you measure it. So.
Okay, you guys, we're a little over, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but really appreciate those of you who stuck with us until the bitter end.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I'm going to stop recording.
That was great. Thank you very much.